What if the calmest people you know are not calm because they are lucky, emotionally numb, or detached from reality, but because they learned something about emotions that most people never discover? And what if, in the next few moments, you realize that emotional strength is not about controlling what you feel, suppressing reactions, or staying positive, but about how your brain decides what your emotions mean before you even notice them? Most people believe, emotionally, healthy individuals feel fewer negative emotions, but the truth is that healthy people feel the full spectrum of emotion just as deeply as everyone else, except their emotions do not hijack their identity, their decisions, or their sense of self in moments of intensity. The core difference is not emotional intensity, but emotional interpretation, because emotions are not responses to events, but responses to the meaning the brain assigns to those events in real time. This is why two people can experience the same rejection, the same failure, or the same loss, and walk away emotionally changed in completely different ways, because the emotion did not come from what happened, but from what the brain decided it meant about safety, worth, and future survival. Healthy people unconsciously understand that emotions are signals, not instructions, and once you stop treating emotions as commands that must be obeyed immediately, their power over your behavior begins to weaken. Instead of reacting the moment an emotion appears, emotionally healthy people create a pause between feeling and action, not through force, but through familiarity with their inner experience. This pause exists because their nervous system has learned that urgency is not the same as danger, and that distinction alone prevents emotional escalation. Most emotional damage does not come from feeling too much, but from reacting too fast. Because when reaction precedes awareness, emotion takes control of behavior. Healthy people allow emotions to exist without immediately trying to change them, explain them, or escape them, because resistance amplifies emotion, while observation softens it. They do not label emotions as good or bad, because judgment adds a secondary emotional layer that intensifies the original feeling. Instead, they treat emotions as temporary internal weather, knowing that storms pass faster when they are not fought. This does not mean they tolerate harmful situations or ignore problems, but rather that they separate emotional experience from impulsive response. They understand that suppressing emotion does not eliminate it, but forces it to leak into behavior, relationships, and health over time. Emotionally healthy people also recognize that many emotional reactions are conditioned responses shaped by past experiences rather than accurate reflections of the present moment. The brain is a prediction machine that scans for familiarity, and when something resembles an old threat, it reacts as if the threat is happening again. This is why fear can arise without danger, anger without injustice, and sadness without loss. Healthy people feel these emotions without assuming they are proof of reality. They understand that feeling anxious does not mean they are unsafe. Feeling angry does not mean they are wronged, and feeling sad does not mean something is broken. This separation between emotion and identity prevents emotional states from becoming personality traits. Instead of saying, "I am anxious," they experience "anxiety is present," which subtly preserves internal stability. Over time, this creates emotional flexibility, which is the ability to move through emotional states without becoming stuck in them. Flexibility, not happiness, is the true marker of emotional health. Emotionally healthy people also regulate emotions through language, because the words used internally determine how the brain categorizes experience. They avoid absolute language, like always, never, and everything, because these words signal threat to the nervous system. Instead of thinking, "This always happens to me," they think, "This is uncomfortable right now," which reduces emotional intensity. They understand that the brain responds to phrasing before logic intervenes. Another defining habit is that emotionally healthy people regulate emotion through the body before the mind. They slow their breathing, soften muscle tension, and ground themselves physically, which sends calming signals to the brain. This works because emotional states are physiological before they are cognitive. Trying to think your way out of emotion often fails, but regulating the body interrupts emotional escalation at its source. This is why breathing changes emotion faster than reasoning. Healthy people also tolerate discomfort without immediate relief because they trust the emotional process. They know emotions rise, peak, and fall naturally when not fed by rumination or avoidance. Instead of distracting themselves instantly, they allow emotions to complete their cycle. This ability is built through repeated exposure to discomfort without catastrophic outcomes. Over time, the nervous system learns that emotional intensity is survivable. Healthy people also set emotional boundaries, which means they do not allow external events to dictate their internal state automatically. They understand that not every opinion, criticism, or rejection deserves emotional access. This selective permeability protects emotional energy. They also avoid excessive rumination, because replaying emotional experiences amplifies them. Instead, they extract meaning once and disengage. Emotionally healthy people practice emotional completion by fully feeling emotions when they arise. This prevents emotional residue from accumulating. They cry when sad, express anger clearly, and grieve fully, which allows faster recovery. They also align actions with values, reducing internal conflict. When behavior matches values, emotional regulation becomes easier. They say no without excessive guilt. They practice self-compassion during emotional difficulty. They normalize emotion without surrendering responsibility. They understand that shame destabilizes emotional regulation. They maintain realistic expectations of life. They accept discomfort as inevitable because they do not expect life to be painless. They are less emotionally shocked by pain. They understand regulation is not control, but relationship. Emotions resist force, but respond to understanding. They cooperate with their inner world instead of fighting it. Over time, emotions flow without chaos. Emotionally healthy people are not immune to pain, but immune to emotional collapse. They allow emotion without letting it define them. And once this becomes habitual, emotional strength feels less like effort and more like stability. This is why emotionally healthy people appear calm, not because they feel less, but because they are no longer afraid of what they feel. Emotionally healthy people also understand something that most people overlook, which is that emotions are shaped not only by present circumstances, but by the accumulated emotional habits built over years of repeated reactions, interpretations, and internal responses. They recognize that the brain learns emotional patterns the same way it learns any behavior, through repetition and reinforcement, which means emotional regulation is not a personality trait, but a trained capacity. This is why healthy people do not panic when they feel strong emotions, because they trust their ability to move through those emotions without losing control. They have experienced emotional intensity before and survived it without catastrophic outcomes, which teaches the nervous system that emotion is not a threat. Most people struggle with emotions not because the emotions are too strong, but because their nervous system associates emotional intensity with danger. Healthy people slowly retrain this association by staying present during emotional activation rather than escaping it. When discomfort arises, they do not immediately distract themselves, numb themselves, or search for external relief, because they understand that avoidance teaches the brain that the emotion was dangerous. Instead, they stay with the sensation long enough for the nervous system to learn that nothing bad happens when emotions are fully felt. This exposure builds emotional resilience, which is the ability to remain regulated under emotional pressure. Emotionally healthy people also regulate emotions by recognizing early signals before emotions become overwhelming. They notice subtle bodily sensations, shifts in breathing, changes in thought patterns, and muscle tension before emotions peak. This early awareness allows them to intervene gently rather than react forcefully. Most emotional outbursts happen because people only notice emotions when they are already intense. Healthy people catch emotions while they are still forming. They notice when irritation begins instead of waiting for anger, when sadness begins instead of waiting for despair, and when anxiety begins instead of waiting for panic. This awareness gives them more choice. They also understand that emotions intensify when they are mixed together. Many people are not just angry, but angry and ashamed, or anxious and guilty, or sad and self-critical. Healthy people separate primary emotions from secondary reactions. They feel sadness without adding shame, anger without adding guilt, and fear without adding self-judgment. This separation dramatically reduces emotional intensity. They understand that the emotion itself is rarely the problem, but the judgment layered on top of it. Emotionally healthy people also regulate emotions by maintaining a stable internal sense of self. They do not allow momentary emotional states to redefine who they are. They know that emotions are experiences, not identities. Because of this, their self-worth does not rise and fall with their emotional state. They can feel insecure without believing they are worthless. They can feel uncertain without believing they are incapable. This internal stability acts as an emotional anchor during difficult moments. Another critical difference is that emotionally healthy people do not expect emotions to be logical. They understand that emotions often arise before conscious reasoning has a chance to intervene. This prevents them from arguing with emotions or demanding that emotions make sense. Instead of saying, "This shouldn't bother me," they acknowledge, "This is bothering me," which reduces internal conflict. They know that emotional acceptance shortens emotional duration. Resistance prolongs emotion. Acceptance allows movement. Emotionally healthy people also understand the role of fatigue, stress, hunger, and overstimulation in emotional regulation. They do not interpret every emotional reaction as a psychological issue. Sometimes they recognize that their nervous system is overloaded rather than emotionally broken. This practical awareness prevents overanalysis. They rest when tired. They eat when depleted. They reduce stimulation when overwhelmed. This physical regulation stabilizes emotional responses. They understand that emotional regulation is supported by lifestyle, not isolated from it. Sleep, movement, nutrition, and downtime all influence emotional stability. Emotionally healthy people also regulate emotions by choosing their inputs carefully. They are aware that the media they consume shapes emotional expectations. They limit exposure to fear-based, outrage-driven, and catastrophizing content. They understand that repeated narratives train the brain to anticipate danger. By curating their inputs, they protect their emotional baseline. They do not constantly flood their nervous system with threat signals. This allows their emotional responses to remain proportionate to reality. Emotionally healthy people also have a healthy relationship with control. They know what they can influence and what they cannot. They do not waste emotional energy fighting reality. When something cannot be changed, they shift focus toward adaptation rather than resistance. This reduces frustration and helplessness. They understand that emotional suffering often comes from trying to control the uncontrollable. Letting go of unnecessary control frees emotional energy. They also regulate emotions by expressing them appropriately. They communicate feelings clearly without emotional dumping. They express anger without aggression and sadness without withdrawal. This prevents emotional buildup. They understand that unexpressed emotion accumulates pressure. Healthy expression releases it safely. They also choose timing wisely. They do not express intense emotion in moments when regulation is compromised. They wait until clarity returns. This protects relationships and self-respect. Emotionally healthy people also understand the difference between emotional honesty and emotional impulsivity. Honesty involves awareness and responsibility. Impulsivity involves discharge without consideration. They choose honesty. Another defining trait is that emotionally healthy people forgive themselves quickly. They do not punish themselves for emotional reactions. They learn from them and move forward. This prevents emotional spirals fueled by self-criticism. They understand that perfection is not required for emotional health. Repair is more important than control. When they react poorly, they repair internally and externally. This builds trust with themselves. Trust reduces emotional volatility. Emotionally healthy people also understand that emotions are influenced by meaning-making over time. They periodically reflect on their beliefs about themselves, others, and the world. They update outdated narratives. They release beliefs that no longer serve emotional stability. This prevents emotional reactions rooted in obsolete interpretations. They are willing to revise their internal models. This flexibility keeps emotional responses current rather than reactive. They also cultivate emotional safety internally. They speak to themselves kindly during distress. They offer reassurance rather than threat. This internal safety calms the nervous system. Fear decreases when the inner environment feels supportive. Emotionally healthy people also understand that regulation does not mean emotional neutrality. They allow joy, excitement, passion, and desire fully. They do not dampen positive emotions out of fear of loss. They trust their capacity to handle emotional change. This openness creates a rich emotional life rather than a restricted one. Ultimately, emotionally healthy people regulate emotions not by controlling them, but by understanding them deeply enough that control becomes unnecessary. Their emotional world becomes navigable rather than overwhelming. And as this understanding deepens, emotional regulation becomes less of a strategy and more of a natural way of being. Emotionally healthy people also develop a deep awareness of how their inner dialogue shapes emotional experience, because they understand that the tone of their internal voice can either calm the nervous system or push it into threat. They do not speak to themselves with hostility during moments of emotional difficulty, because they know that self-attack amplifies stress and destabilizes regulation. Instead, they use language that acknowledges discomfort without adding pressure, which keeps emotional responses proportional. This compassionate inner dialogue does not excuse harmful behavior, but it prevents emotional collapse while accountability remains intact. They understand that the nervous system responds to perceived support, even when that support comes from within. Another subtle habit emotionally healthy people share is that they give emotions time before drawing conclusions. They do not assume that how they feel in one moment represents the full truth of a situation. They understand that emotions fluctuate based on context, physiology, and mental state. This patience prevents impulsive decisions made under temporary emotional conditions. They wait for emotional clarity before taking action on major decisions. This delay is not avoidance, but wisdom. Emotionally healthy people also recognize the difference between emotional pain and emotional suffering. Pain is the initial emotional response to a difficult event. Suffering is the prolonged mental resistance to that pain. They allow pain without feeding suffering. They feel grief without building identity around loss. They feel disappointment without constructing a narrative of failure. This distinction reduces emotional endurance of difficult states. They also understand that emotions seek resolution through meaning rather than elimination. Instead of trying to get rid of emotions, they ask what the emotion is pointing toward. They listen without obedience. This listening often reveals unmet needs, violated values, or unresolved boundaries. Once the underlying issue is addressed, the emotion naturally softens. Emotionally healthy people do not fear emotional intensity because they trust their recovery process. They know that intense emotions are temporary states, not permanent conditions. This trust prevents panic during emotional peaks. They also understand that emotional regulation improves through repetition rather than insight alone. They practice responding differently to familiar emotional triggers. Each regulated response rewires neural pathways. Over time, the emotional baseline shifts. What once felt overwhelming becomes manageable. What once felt threatening becomes tolerable. This is how emotional strength is built quietly over time. Emotionally healthy people also pay attention to emotional energy rather than emotional labels. They notice whether an emotion feels activating or draining. They respond accordingly. If energy is high, they channel it constructively. If energy is low, they rest rather than push. This energy-based awareness prevents burnout. They do not demand productivity from emotional depletion. They honor emotional cycles. Another critical habit is that emotionally healthy people do not outsource emotional regulation to others. They do not rely on constant reassurance to feel stable. They do not depend on external validation to regulate self-worth. They appreciate support, but they do not require it to remain grounded. This internal regulation creates emotional independence. It also strengthens relationships by removing emotional pressure. Emotionally healthy people also recognize that emotional regulation includes allowing emotions to change. They do not cling to positive emotions out of fear of loss. They allow happiness to fade without panic. They allow sadness to pass without resistance. This non-attachment keeps emotional flow natural. They understand that clinging creates suffering. Letting go creates movement. Emotionally healthy people also understand that emotions are influenced by environment. They choose environments that support regulation. They reduce exposure to chaotic or toxic dynamics when possible. They create routines that stabilize mood. They understand that emotional regulation is easier in supportive contexts. This is not weakness, but self-awareness. They also understand the role of meaning in emotional endurance. They can tolerate discomfort longer when it aligns with purpose. They suffer less when pain has context. This meaning-based regulation allows them to endure challenges without emotional collapse. Emotionally healthy people do not confuse emotional regulation with emotional suppression. They express emotions honestly while maintaining responsibility. They do not bottle emotions until they explode. They release emotion incrementally. This prevents buildup. They also understand that emotional regulation includes joy regulation. They allow joy without guilt. They allow pleasure without self-judgment. They do not sabotage positive emotion out of fear of disappointment. This balance creates emotional richness. Emotionally healthy people also practice emotional repair after conflict. They acknowledge emotional missteps. They apologize when necessary. They reconnect. This repair prevents emotional residue from lingering. They understand that repair restores safety faster than defensiveness. Safety stabilizes emotions. Emotionally healthy people also allow emotions to inform, not dominate, decisions. They consider emotional data alongside logic. They do not ignore emotion. They also do not obey it blindly. This integration creates balanced decisions. They trust themselves because they have proven their ability to regulate. Trust reduces emotional urgency. Emotionally healthy people also recognize that emotional regulation evolves with life stages. They update strategies as circumstances change. They do not cling to outdated coping mechanisms. They remain adaptive. This adaptability protects emotional health over time. They understand that emotional maturity is not a destination, but an ongoing process. And as this process continues, emotional regulation becomes increasingly effortless. What once required conscious effort becomes automatic. Emotional stability emerges naturally, and with that stability, life feels less chaotic and more navigable. Even when emotions run deep, emotionally healthy people eventually reach a point where emotional regulation is no longer something they actively think about in the moment, because it has become an integrated part of how they relate to themselves, others, and life as a whole. They do not wake up each day asking how to manage their emotions, because their internal systems have learned stability through repetition, awareness, and trust. This does not mean emotions stop arising, but it means emotions stop feeling disruptive. They understand that emotions are meant to move, inform, and pass, not to define identity or dictate behavior. Because of this understanding, they experience fewer internal power struggles. They no longer fight themselves when emotions arise. They cooperate with their inner experience. This cooperation creates a sense of inner peace that is not dependent on external calm. Emotionally healthy people also recognize that emotional regulation is deeply connected to self-trust. They trust that they can handle whatever emotion arises. This trust removes the fear of feeling. When fear of emotion disappears, emotional intensity naturally decreases. They are not bracing against their inner world. They are open to it. This openness prevents emotional buildup. They also understand that emotional regulation does not mean emotional predictability. They allow themselves to be surprised by their feelings without judgment. They remain curious rather than critical. Curiosity softens emotional reactions. Judgment hardens them. Emotionally healthy people approach their inner world with interest rather than control. They ask what emotions are communicating instead of trying to silence them. This listening does not mean obedience. It means awareness. Awareness restores choice. With choice comes freedom. Emotionally healthy people also understand that emotional regulation is relational. They choose relationships where emotional expression is safe. They distance themselves from environments that punish vulnerability. They know that emotional health cannot thrive in constant threat. This discernment protects emotional stability. They do not confuse tolerance with strength. They understand that enduring harmful dynamics destabilizes regulation over time. They also understand that boundaries are emotional regulators. Clear boundaries prevent emotional overload. Unclear boundaries invite chronic stress. Emotionally healthy people enforce boundaries calmly. They do not over-explain. They do not justify excessively. They trust their internal signals. This trust simplifies emotional decisions. They also understand that emotional regulation includes grief, because loss is inevitable. They do not rush grief. They do not pathologize it. They allow grief to unfold at its own pace. This allowance prevents complicated grief. They understand that grief honors connection. They do not attempt to regulate grief away. They regulate how they carry it. Emotionally healthy people also understand that emotional regulation includes anger. They do not fear anger. They respect it. They recognize anger as a boundary signal. They express it clearly rather than explosively. They do not suppress it into resentment. They do not discharge it into harm. They translate it into action or communication. This transforms anger into clarity. Emotionally healthy people also understand that emotional regulation includes fear. They do not eliminate fear. They contextualize it. They assess whether fear is informative or reactive. They respond accordingly. They do not shame themselves for fear. They do not let fear decide for them. They walk forward with fear when necessary. This courage is built through regulation. Emotionally healthy people also understand that emotional regulation includes joy. They allow joy fully. They savor it. They do not dampen it out of superstition. They trust that joy can coexist with uncertainty. This trust creates emotional richness rather than emotional restriction. They do not live defensively. They live responsively. Emotionally healthy people also understand that emotional regulation includes failure. They do not collapse after mistakes. They reflect. They repair. They adapt. They do not define themselves by one moment. They maintain continuity of self. This continuity stabilizes emotion. They understand that emotional collapse often follows identity collapse. They protect identity through perspective. Emotionally healthy people also understand that emotional regulation is influenced by meaning over time. They build lives that feel coherent. They align daily actions with values. This alignment reduces emotional friction. When life makes sense internally, emotions settle more easily. They also understand that emotional regulation includes rest. They do not glorify constant stimulation. They allow stillness. Stillness resets the nervous system. Rest is not avoidance. Rest is maintenance. Emotionally healthy people also understand that emotional regulation includes humility. They accept that they will still react imperfectly. They do not demand mastery. They practice repair instead of self-punishment. This gentleness sustains long-term regulation. They understand that emotional health is not about never struggling, but about struggling without losing oneself. They recover faster because they do not abandon themselves in difficulty. They stay internally present. This presence is stabilizing. Over time, emotional regulation becomes less about technique and more about identity. They become the kind of person who can feel deeply without falling apart. They become someone who can experience intensity without chaos. They become someone who trusts their inner world. And this trust changes everything. Because when you are no longer afraid of your emotions, you stop fighting yourself. When you stop fighting yourself, emotional regulation becomes natural. And when regulation becomes natural, life feels steadier, clearer, and more grounded, even when emotions rise and fall. This is why emotionally healthy people appear calm, not because they feel less, but because they have learned how to let emotions move through them without losing who they are. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful or eye-opening, make sure to hit the like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe for more practical psychology insights, self-awareness tools, and mind-sharpening advice. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.